Good morning, everyone. This is May 5th, 2017, Cinco de Mayo. I have been up walking on Mount Tabor. On the way down, I stopped at a coffee shop and Common Ground, and I read a lot of this Harper's issue, including the cover story. I was also interested in the Dennett, the recap of his book, a book review. Towards the end of this issue, mind brain is going to be a topic here, and just consciousness was the topic in this Harper's review. So, in going back and forth, I want to establish that we should really look at Synergetics. So, I'm about to hold up a picture of it, or this is the book. We should think of this as a philosophy, and I think one reason we don't in the prevailing sort of ethnic climate in which we live today, philosophers are pretty much academic, and they've agreed in certain turfy ways that they don't compete in terms of patents. Like if you're a philosopher, you're not trying to like outshine other philosophers at the patent office. And but Wittgenstein, he kind of started out in that way. He was going to be an engineer, and I know quite a bit about the Wittgenstein stuff. Vienna Circle. I'm going to make a link to how Portland in the early 2000s, late 1900s, is kind of like a Vienna. We have a really thriving culture here, and like just last night, I was at this fantastic lecture by a major scientist about the origins of life, a guy from Germany here, actually from Texas, Dr. William. I'll get you more information in a future blog post probably. Anyway, look at how we get to hang out with the big scientists like Linus Pauling lecture series. He was a hero of a lot of us in this part of the world. 2 Nobel Prizes, 1 for peace. Okay, I'm starting to go forward again. So Portland, a thriving civilization, and this is my little timeline going along inside Portland. We could call it a scenario. And the way Fuller defined universe when he did is partially overlapping scenarios. So you could sort of see that as intersubjective if you want to, but you can also just acknowledge that everything has its story, and those stories partially overlap, right? And in telling that story, we define the characters, and we compartmentalize and do all these kind of things to make sense of the story. But in the Fuller worlds, you don't have to, in order to make sense, bring the universe into the picture as a single solitary episodic, momentarily glimpsed thing. Like you don't ever have to really see the universe in order to live in it. You don't have to get outside the house and look at it as a single conceptual thing, like you can with a ball, for example. This we could call conceptual. But for Fuller, the universe was not conceptual in that sense. It was eternally aconceptual. Interesting to put that in as part of your philosophy. I think that was kind of a way to resist idolatry even of the universe. We're kind of schooled in the religion department to not be too idolatrous about the deity or God or any God really. And so all these prohibitions, like in Islam, they've gotten pretty strict. It wasn't always like that. About even showing Muhammad, which is, I'm not endorsing any particular religion. And in fact, I think the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, the Pastafarians, they have something pretty close to partially overlapping scenario universe in their deity. So if we're going to be idolatrous, might as well go with something kind of spoofy, kind of subgenius, not take ourselves too seriously. But what Fuller did to establish Synergetics as a philosophy and not just some kind of math or architecture, even though there were patents involved and so forth, why he should be taken seriously as a philosopher has to do with this mind-brain distinction. And I would argue that it's a waste to take such separate words with their own inertia, their own gravitas, and to force them to mean the same thing. We can use them differently. It's part of an economical move to not, take two very good words and just make them mean exactly the same thing by fiat. So Fuller has what he calls the mind-brain distinction. And I think you can kind of feel, oh, that's not fashionable. It's starting to sound like mind-brain, or it's starting to sound like Cartesian duality, and that's not in vogue anymore. Why would we want to go back to something like that? Well, good question. First of all, I would say it's not really like that. It's more like the brain TV, the program you live, your experience of being in the universe. That's what we would say is below the line in this picture. That's where I wrote the word brain. And SC stands for special case. This is the episodic world that we are inevitably caught up in. We have no way of getting out of it, really. And then on top, above the line, is what I call PreFrequency, and that's, you could call it the Platonic. That's what maybe if you go back in time, you would have heard it called the Platonic realm. What turned out, though, is that a lot of those polyhedra that the Greeks were imagining could only exist in some perfect world of forms, because they could imagine them, of course. Actually, we find them in nature. It's just they're really, really small, so they were much smaller than the Greeks could see at the time. But you have some pretty perfect geometric structures at the tiny level. I just wanted to put in a plug for that book, right? So Fuller, he burst on the scene in the 60s pretty much as kind of a rebel. He was trying to help people be more self-sufficient, more autonomous, and the whole thing of building your own dome and living off the grid and maybe having your own grid, that was in the wind. And Fuller was sort of a champion of this sort of back to the land, do-it-yourself maker culture, where people had their own 3D printers and could build their own farms and do their own thing, except they didn't have 3D printers yet. And yet, in my talk in Synergetics 101, the first playlist that I did, I hardly talk about anything spherical. I don't get into the domes or the spheres all that much. All you have to do is start spinning these things, and you get there. But I really wanted to slow it all down and get it more just focused on these so-called mites and building blocks, A, B, and S modules, T and E modules. So if you watch Synergetics 101, you probably realize now there's a lot there geometry-wise, but is it a philosophy? You're convinced now that it has content, but you're still thinking, oh, but it's architecture, because we're talking about CAD, computer-aided design, and we're talking about, building things. These come out, by the way, I could take this apart and we could do a whole video on that, and I'm gonna at some point. But here in Portland, we have a great culture of smart inventor type people. I didn't invent this. This is Sam Lanahan's invention, C60. We have this 3D printer world now. We have this ability to design our way out of a lot of problems. And the mind-brain distinction is about ephemeralization. That's why it has utility, and why philosophers maybe should come back to it, not as Cartesian dualism, but a way of talking about how, as we get more attuned to generalized principles. Fuller didn't like the word law that much. It's too much monarchic, too Roman imperialist, always this law, jurisprudence. Why do we want to talk like lawyers anyway? So generalized principles. As we become more attuned to the generalized principles, more brain, more attuned to mind, as Fuller would put it, we learn to do more with less. We learn to take hundreds of tons of copper cable that we needed at one point to connect our continents to do phone conversations. Now we can have a satellite that's much less consumptive of physical materials. So we do more with less as we come to understand more about the generalized principles. And we have exponential abilities in that regard, and Fuller was always trying to bring attention to that to help us from getting too demoralized, because like humans get demoralized, and then that sort of paralysis sets in too then, because deer in the headlights, whatever. So Fuller has a reputation for being kind of a positive futurist, but he would say he's not really an optimist, because that's like, kind of Pollyanna, and he was ready to admit it's a serious and dire situation. But he had a lot of hope because he knew science, and not because he was just like, lighting a lot of candles all the time. That may help. Just like this thinking in terms of mind and brain, that may get you to be more intuitive. So for that reason alone, I think it's worth keeping these words separate, kind of keeping a little bit of a voltage pressure here. Anyway, my main point, synergetics is philosophy and needs to be categorized that way, even if there were some patents involved. We'll talk more in the near future, I hope. Happy Cinco de Mayo.